This is the second last lesson of the reading of The Dream House by Craig Higginson. In this lesson, we begin the last part of the novel, Part 5 or Act 5. By now you are familiar with the 5-act dramatic structure of the novel. This last section is the denouement. It comes from the French word meaning to untie or unknot. In drama or literature, it is the term that is used for the tying up of loose ends at the end of the narrative. In many instances, it's the "and they lived happily ever after" moment. Turn to page 211. Patricia has visions and dreams of the Bloodwood Forest being destroyed, the farm ceasing to exist, even the house in Durban crashing down. She reflects on the ancient Egyptians and how they suspected that death was indeed the end of all, and what they wanted was to keep their possessions close to them. She calls for Beauty and asks her to tell Becky to retrieve Rachel's coffin and place it securely in a blue trunk. She plans to rebury Rachel at St. Thomas's Church. She thinks about the nature of the house, its simplicity, its smells, its essential lack of upgrades. She thinks about the quality of grace, grace as in lowercase g, an abstract noun, and how she once had this thanks to her father, but lost it by marrying Richard. She hears Richard cry out and notices, mystified, how Beauty reassures Richard and starts readying him even with her knowledge of what Richard has done. Richard, without his pants on, comes through to the kitchen for breakfast. Listen to the audio recording of this passage on the next slide.
Patricia, page 211 to 215. She draws back the curtains to reveal the mist. It lies there as it did before, filling the valley and invading every cupboard of the house. The Bloodwoods are also present, like attendant ghosts awaiting instructions. Little do they know how soon they will be levelled. The mottled grey bowls flecked with lichen will soon be torn into by a row of spinning teeth, and the fresh red wood will lie exposed. The shock of colour that has always been their secret. She dreamed all night again about the earth movers. But this time it was the Durban house under attack, with all of them inside it. And the yellow and black machines were more like locusts, swaying their forelegs, their mandibles moving, with tiny men sitting inside their eyes, which glittered like black diamonds. The venerable facade of the old house swayed and came down with a crash, and the machines moved in, over the crushed glass of the conservatory, their long jagged limbs foraging through the rubble, trying to get at them. But if the Bloodwoods are still there, it means that Rachel will be there too, safe in her grave on the hill. Suddenly, she understands the ancient Egyptians. It wasn't that they wanted to take the world they knew with them into the afterlife. They probably suspected, like most of us, their death was the end of it all. No, it was far more likely that what they wanted was to protect their belongings from the reach of others. They wanted to keep that which was sacred to them close to them. For objects know nothing about loyalty. They know they will never be owned by anyone, like the body of Rachel. They had to be protected by those who understood their value, for they had no ability to value themselves. Beauty! Oh, she has been listening to the sounds inside the house since before dawn. Richard cried out at one point, a wheezing gasp like a fox. But she left him to his bad dreams or wild imaginings. There was also the sound of leathery feet, scratchy feet, marching along the iron roof. The rock pigeons, waiting for the sun to come up. And then, just before dawn, the creaking of the drongos, followed by the hadidas, and the eternal squabble in the trees. By the time Beauty finally entered the house, with the discreet squeak of the fly screen, never to be heard again, the first rumble of the earth movers had already started up. For the first time since Patricia can remember, Beauty appears at the bedroom door without a second call. She looks different today because she's wearing a dress. It's a dress Patricia has seen her donning for funerals. A simple cotton garment with small blue flowers. Forget-me-not, perhaps. But her feet as bare. Her feet are as bare as usual. How are you this morning, Beauty? I'm fine, Mrs. Good. Did you sleep well? Not so good, Mrs. No, not so good, Patricia says, smiling. They gaze at each other. But Beauty's body, out of habit, out of duty, is still leaning in the direction of Richard, as no one has checked up on him yet. It occurs to Patricia that they could stop checking up on him altogether. They could get in the car and drive off to Durban and leave him here on the farm to dodge the boulders and find a comfortable porcupine hole to nest in at night. He could probably get by on earthworms and brambleberries. He could be a parting gift to look smart. I have been thinking about the grave, she says. Yebo, Mrs. Beauty, who often apprehends her thoughts better than she does, seems to know which grave she is talking about. I would like Becky to go there and take her out. Could you go with him? I want you to make sure everything is okay. Beauty doesn't flinch at this latest task. Or if she does, she gives no sign of it. Yebo, missus. He can put the coffin in that blue trunk, the one on the floor of the old tack room. And he must position the coffin inside and then surround it with earth. I don't want it to move about. It has to be properly supported, all right? Beauty inclines her head and says nothing, her eyes moving as she rehearses the task. He can use one of the old combination locks to lock it up. She continues, I've been thinking she should be buried where my parents are, at the old St. Thomas's Church. I was married there and christened there, and both my parents are buried there too. The oats is waiting for her in the kitchen as usual. But today, the silver sugar bowl has been packed away, and there is only a brown packet of sugar with a teaspoon inside it. The milk is in a chipped, pale yellow jug that Patricia doesn't recognize. And the milk is still warm from the cow that made it. The cow that will go to the family of Begi's wife in Masinga Top. Patricia stands in the kitchen, inhaling the smell of dank cupboards and leaking gas. Now that the room is bare, and there is nothing left in it to see but the room itself, she realizes that it looks like a poor person's kitchen. Since their arrival, she has not upgraded the kitchen. She has never upgraded anything. She simply accepted the kitchen and the rest of the house as a fact, as one would accept a tree on the horizon, a thing that was already itself and didn't need further intervention. If anything, she has wanted to preserve the simplicity of the house. Its simplicity used to strike her as a form of honesty. Like her father, it was unashamedly itself. And it asked the same of all those who passed through it. She loved the way the little gas burners above the baths and the kitchen sink started up only when you needed warm water, and the way the wood-fueled aga heated one half of the house, the south-facing half, through the winter. Until fairly recently, they still had that wind-up phone that connected them to the operator in the village, a solitary, forgettable woman called Miss Pembroke, who must have listened on every exchange between herself and John Ford. Yes, Patricia has liked to feel a bit medieval in this house. When she was pregnant, she found herself making big stews for herself and her husband, throwing in any vegetable or herb that was currently available from the garden, and hunks of freshly cut meat from the farm, usually lamb. The prospect of a fecund and varied life still lay ahead of them, and back then, Patricia imagined that this funny, diminished kitchen, no more than a corner of this house, ill-lit from its high south-facing windows, would provide the heart of the house. Soon afterwards, they failed their first test following the death of Rachel. and they had failed just about every other test since. Only now can she see how ignorant she was, because she had always had a gracious life. She imagined it would continue and that grace was a characteristic you were born with. She never knew and was never told that grace had to be worked for and protected. So-called grace may only ever have come from her father, by association, ending as soon as she went off with Richard. She once said to John Ford that it was not Richard himself she wanted back then. It was the idea of a life that she thought would come through him, along with the novelty of sex, which she later realized she could have found with almost any man. As she looks at the room's worn surfaces and the dead flies along the windowsill, she knows that she chose this, that she helped to create it. Even now, she does not understand the source of her abiding apathy. But she has sometimes wondered whether it was her father's love that ruined her, for everything else since then has been a bit of a disappointment. From deep inside the house, she hears Richard crying out again, followed by the murmured reassurances of Beauty, who is probably trying to get him dressed. She sprinkles sugar over the oats and lets it melt before adding milk. All those years, she thinks. And Beauty never said a word, not about Richard, not about Grace, not about any of it. And there she is, still dressing him, feeding him, wiping his ass, instead of doing what Look Smart wanted to do and cutting out his heart. Can you tell me where the bathroom is? Richard is standing at the doorway, wearing his blue pajama shirt and nothing else. His genitals are like an old peach withered into itself and fluffy with mold. He's almost luminous, standing in the sunlight. He's made of white dust. If she blew in his direction, he might disappear. What did Look Smart call him again? A moth. Yes, without any substance left. She knows now that Look Smart's way of looking at him will be, at least in part, her way of looking at him. Come and eat your oats, Roo. We have a long journey ahead of us. And where are we off to? Exactly. Beauty appears with his corduroys and stares at her, looking helpless. But she is far from helpless. She's simply self-conscious in front of Patricia. She can't work with Richard, as she usually does under Patricia's gaze. We are going to the sea. Patricia says this as she continues to eat her oats. she sees from the corner of her eye Richard stepping obediently into his pants. She doesn't ask why he isn't being given any underpants. But I don't know how to swim, he says. Of course you do. You can't have forgotten that. Beauty pulls back his chair and he sits. Well, what would you know about it? He says, eyeing the sugar and then helping himself too far, too much.
Beauty's continued acts of service towards Richard are disturbing, even nauseating. Despite what she has suffered, she continues to look after him, addressing his most intimate needs. What do you think Patricia is implying when she thinks that they should leave Richard for Looksmart as a parting gift? The references to grace and graciousness are significant. There is an obvious play on words here. The characteristics of Grace, small g, and Grace, capital G, the murdered farm worker, and Norma, the name of Looksmart's daughter. Pause the video here. Take time to understand the multi-layered meanings of the word grace. It is no coincidence that this is the character's name. We return to Becky on page 216. He and Beauty are standing at the edge of the trees. We know that it was Richard scratching around the grave, trying to retrieve it. Instead, the dog's grave has been dug up, and bones have been unearthed. After digging deeply, he finds the coffin. He thinks of Beauty as a moody person, and he is aware that she loves him, even though she thinks that he doesn't know. Once he decided to marry Pumelele, Beauty stopped talking to him for a year. Following the birth of Bongani, Beauty resumed talking to him and pitied his life, deciding to carry on loving him as a man likes to love a saint. Becky has resolved not to tell Beauty that he won't remain working for the family. Looksmart's offer is just too good to turn down. He thinks of his time with the family as a distasteful dance. He was just a boy when the coffin was originally put into the earth. He remembers Patricia's grief, her overeating, and her then returning to old habits once Looksmart had left. The same shops, the same car, the same food, and later visiting John Ford. It was only Looksmart who had been able to cheer up Patricia back then. White people can ask their helpers to do anything, no matter how undignified. Would they stand for this themselves in their own jobs? On page 220, we have the beginning of a lengthy passage by Patricia. The phone is still ringing, and because Becky and Beauty are carrying the coffin, Patricia wheels across the room to answer it. It's Mrs. Bell from the school, and she brings the news that John Ford has committed suicide. The police have requested that Patricia come to the house. It is with weariness that she observes, it seems she'll be able to commune with her child properly only when she herself is dead. Becky drives her to the Ford house, where the police and ambulance are waiting. It transpires that John had cancer, which was spreading rapidly through his body and had recently reached his brain. She goes to see the body, noticing the framed watercolor paintings on the walls, places they visited together or discussed. She sees him lying on the bed and wonders what he was thinking before he took his own life. She has difficulty reconciling herself with the idea of his suicide. Listen to Dr. Zwichers as she reads this section to you.
Patricia, page 220 to 228. The telephone continues to ring as she follows the coffin into the house. Not knowing what else to do with it, Becky and Beauty place the coffin before the dead fireplace at the foot of the mantelpiece. The round stone Richard brought in the previous evening is still sitting there, the orange clay having since dried into a pale terracotta grey. As the phone is still ringing, when the other two are gone, she wheels across to pick it up. Is that Patricia Wiley? It is. Oh, this is Mrs. Bell from the school. Oh, hello. There's no reason for Mrs. Bell to call. There's a high anxiety in her voice. Patricia asks her what has happened. Oh, it is John Ford. I'm afraid there has been an accident. Is he dead? I am so sorry. Murdered? I don't. No, I don't think so. Patricia now asks the question that passed through her. For some reason, the moment she heard Mrs. Bell's ridiculous voice. Are you saying that John has killed himself? Well, it looks like that may be the case. At his house? Oh, yes. Mrs. Bell also knew about their affair. For years, she was the one who did the necessary covering up. But it doesn't quite explain why Patricia is being called now. Would you like me to go over there? She says. I'm afraid the police have requested it. Why is that? Oh, because he left a note. I understand, she says. Understanding nothing. I'll be right over. She puts down the phone and stares at the blue tin trunk. It seems she will be able to commune with the child properly only when she herself is dead. She finds the letter in the cubbyhole where she stuffed it, and is about to open it when she feels Becky's hungry gaze on her. So instead she pushes it into her handbag. It is John Ford, she says. Apparently he died last night. Becky nods and says nothing, in a way that suggests that Beauty has already told him the gist of it. They drive away from the house in silence. Patricia hardly seeing the farm and its churned up ruin of earth and rock. The landscape is still lost in the mist. There's only the car following the dirt road, with nothing but a void at either end of it, to a degree that she would not have only a day before. She feels herself responsible for this latest event. Her crime, it seems, with Richard, with look smart, and now with John, has been a lack of imagination. She thought it was enough to sit in her house on the hill, thinking her thoughts, measuring her days, issuing only the most necessary instructions. But Look Smart's visit has changed all that, simply from the direction of his gaze, which could pick its way through a million moments in her life and bring to her attention one or two whose consequences had endured. And endured horribly. It is a gaze she will now be able to apply to herself at her leisure, and she will be even more effective than he, since she has access to each of her decisions and their effects as they labor along the road. The image of the black puppy keeps finding its way back into her head. The way it would run along the fence of the dog run after the girls going towards the dairy, stumbling over its paws, while she sat back and laughed at it. There is an ambulance, a police car, and a small yellow Toyota standing at odd angles in the gravel driveway. The driver of the ambulance is sitting on a rock in front of a bed of blooming agapanthus, smoking a cigarette, looking towards the sky, perhaps willing the sun to come out. Becky parks in the usual place, extracts the walker from the boot and opens the door for her. He does not enter after her, but turns and walks away from the house, perhaps off to catch a cigarette. John's tobacco smoke is still lingering in the curtains and the furniture of the house. His fragrant exhalations. The golf clubs are stacked against the wall, each of the clubs peering out, eager for use. She stops in the corridor, near the entrance to the sitting room, wondering where to go, listening out for voices, but all is still. Perhaps the body's already in the ambulance. All she's clear about is that she doesn't want to have to look at it. Hello? It's odd to call for someone in John's house that isn't John. She feels his vacancy answering back at her. Then she hears a murmur coming from the bedroom, a room she hasn't been to since she doesn't want to think about it. A young woman appears, surprisingly pretty. Not at all like the police officer she might have come to expect. She's of Indian origin and speaks with what Patricia, in a less fraught situation, might have described as a white person's Durban accent. I'm glad you came. You must be Patricia. Yes? I'm so sorry to bring you here, but there's something I would like to talk to you about. Mrs. Bell appears on cue from behind her. A tall woman on the far side of 50, with a mop of hair dyed in a reddish brown and eyeliner smeared from weeping. She was John's secretary during all his years as headmaster. And for all Patricia knows, she works at the school still. John always liked to claim that Mrs. Bell could be trusted. But Patricia has never had an actual conversation with her, let alone looked at her properly. Hello, Patricia. Mrs. Bell speaks as though they are better acquainted, almost friends, and inevitably brought closer through this event. As she returns the greeting, it occurs to Patricia that she doesn't even know Mrs. Bell's first name. They always called her Mrs. Bell. What happened exactly? She asks. Mrs. Bell inclines her body towards the policewoman, leaving her to speak. The case is obviously still under investigation, the policewoman says, but it appears Mr. Ford has taken his own life. Patricia says nothing to this. She still can't quite believe it. In her head, John would have been the last person to do such a thing. Oh, but then what does she know about him and the contents of his head? They have been having much the same conversation for years now. It rarely touched on anything dangerous in her. So why should it have been any different for him? But I saw him yesterday. He seemed extremely well. So you didn't know? Says Mrs. Bell, almost enthusiastically. He didn't tell you. Tell me what? About the cancer. All the way up his spine. Last week the doctor gave him a couple of months. Apparently it had recently spread to his brain. She had not for a moment expected this, of course. She stands there bewildered, feeling caught out, humiliated. She can feel Mrs. Bell's gaze on her. It's far too interested to be decent. No, she says. I knew nothing about that. Well, the policewoman says more kindly, it seems he left a note about you. Patricia sees then that the policewoman is holding a piece of paper, folded in half, with Mrs. Bell's name scrawled across it. There was always an extravagance about John's handwriting that used to annoy and somehow belittle her. What does it say? The policewoman gives her the paper, while Mrs. Bell looks knowingly on. It reads, Dear Janet, please don't disturb Patricia with news of this event. With thanks, John. Do you know why he would write that? The policewoman says. No, says Patricia. Oh, but I imagined he... He wanted to spare me, at least for a bit. Spare you? The policewoman continues. Spare you what, exactly? Ah, the opportunity to care, to feel extravagantly. Ah, I don't know, Patricia says. But he knew I was supposed to be leaving for Durban today. Perhaps he didn't want to stop me. I see. The policewoman says, and the two of you were friends? Old friends, yes. Does Mrs. Bell smirk slightly at this? Or is Patricia imagining it? What is Mrs. Bell? She suddenly wonders. Some sort of moralist. Oh, she certainly has a sufficient amount of malice. Well, I'm sorry. It must come as a terrible shock. Oh, yes. The policewoman seems to be waiting for her to say something more, but Patricia has nothing more to say. Where is he? She says, simply in order to speak. We've laid him out on the bed. The domestic worker found him in the bathroom. The poor woman thought he'd been murdered. She immediately called the police. Oh, Agnes, yes. Would you like to see him? Patricia can sense the other two women are expecting her to decline this and hurry away. But Patricia now finds that she actually would like to see him. She would like to look at his face and find out whether or not it is too late to care about him, to feel extravagantly. I think I would like to see him. Yes. Mrs. Bell lets out another sniff of what feels like disapproval before moving away. What was it with this woman? Was she outraged or merely jealous? Perhaps she had also been in love with John. Perhaps she had even been his lover. What did Patricia know about John but one or two facts? In other words, nothing at all. Patricia turns away from the other woman and edges forward with a walker, as if wanting to signal to Mrs. Bell her crippled body, her helplessness in the world. But Mrs. Bell is already withdrawing down the corridor towards the stoep. I'm ready, she says, feeling the long dark pull of John's body from the other room, knowing she'll never be ready for this. The policewoman nods and moves towards the bedroom, slowly, so as to give the older woman the opportunity to shuffle along. Patricia doesn't look at the watercolors along the corridor that he painted during their years together, the landscapes of nearby places they visited. Caversham Hill, Caversham Mill, Inverurie Falls, Midmar Dam. For one of his birthdays, she got them all framed together, each one with the same cream mounting and black border. Amongst them are also other landscapes, He explored with the other boys, mainly the foothills and peaks of the Drakensberg. He claims to have slept in every cave in the region. The boys cooking their rice and toppers over their gas stoves, laying on the rocky earth as the rain drummed all night outside, waking to miracles of snow or waterfalls frozen into a million shards over a precipice. All of it culminated at the end of this thin corridor, this doomed room. After all that light and open space, after each day of getting up and getting things done, after all his noble words in assembly, on speech day, in chapel, this was the nature of John's passing. But she will think about all of this only later. She is deciding instead that she will have to remain close by him until he's buried, and that they will have to delay their departure for Durban. She recalls again that she never quite believed they would leave the farm. As for Luke Smart's estate, it could grow up all around them. And she and Richard could remain in the house. And those who came to live there afterwards could peer at them through the windows like visitors at the aquarium, staring at strange fish from another time. Only the bedside lamp is on. The soft pool of light cutting across half his face. From a distance, the dear weathered features looked intact. And he seems relaxed and solemn at first. The mouth longer, the nose much more prominent, the eyes sunk back into themselves, knowing their job is done. She looks for the wound and finds a dark blot under his chin where the bullet went in. She can't think what has happened to the back of his head, which is lying deeper into the pillow than might have been expected. It is too horrendous to contemplate. Her mind gawps at it. Instead, she looks at his downturned mouth that once in another life she kissed. It was a mouth, she once told him, that always looked rather dismayed in sleep. She is used to seeing the dead. The life leaked out of them, so that all that remains is the vessel, its bloodless glow. She has seen expressions of agony and calm, optimism and dread, fixed in time, and always death's equanimity shining through. There was only ever a distant kinship between the dead body and the one that had lived, which always suggested to her that the body was not the point after all, and that it only acquired its true status in death, having claimed far too much importance for itself during life. She can hardly remember her mother dead. The new vacancy running through the house like a dry wind is what she remembers most of all, not the body itself. What she recalls most about the body of her father was its smallness. Not only the length of him, but the narrowness of his shoulders, the neatness of his limbs, the fine bony child's hands, the head, not much bigger than a doll's. Was this all there was to him? She remembers thinking. It looked like he could have been folded up and fitted into one of his desk drawers. What sets the body of John aside is the violence of his death, the violence he has done to himself. She can't look at him and not think of it, not wonder at it. He's two things now: John dead and a man who found it in himself to end his life. This first man she can still approach. She can still approach. The first man she can still approach with her intuition, her thought. She can find John's calm in him, his solitude. This man looks much the same size as she remembers him, and his hands are still recognizable to her and turned almost outwards, as if inviting her to take hold of them. But that other man, the one who killed himself, that man is pushing the more familiar man aside, insisting on the mystery that must run through all things. Patricia can sense the policewoman at the door, looking and not looking, neither in the room nor out of it. For a moment, she confuses the woman with herself and feels that she, Patricia, no longer exists where she exists. And so she gasps air into her, and as she does, so she imagines that the other woman is mistaking the sound for grief. But it isn't grief. She's still far too dislocated to feel anything so coherent yet. She looks at the face for the last time and sees he must have shaved shortly before his death. There's a bit of shaving cream below his earlobe and a brief crop of hairs under his chin that was left out. She wonders what this man thought as he shaved himself in the small round mirror above the sink. Whether he knew he was going to kill himself, whether he still believed in God, or did he find, when it came down to it, that he could put aside the idea of God as easily as he could put aside the idea of his own life? What happens now? She says. He'll be taken to the forensics laboratory in Maritzburg. Mrs. Bell has informed his next of kin. Oh, I'm sure she has. As the policewoman carries on speaking, she finds she doesn't want to see John's children or watch them crowding around his coffin with their Australian spouses and their Australian children. pretending his passing is a huge loss to them, while all the time eyeing the grandfather clock in the hallway, the antique officer's sword above the fireplace, and the dining room table. Oh, they will no doubt want to argue over the paintings along the corridor, whose meaning only she can explain, and will wonder who that lingering overweight woman is with her perplexed expression and whiff of sour cream. "Goodbye, John," she says. But John only answers back with his silence, the hard knot of vacancy that will now be in the world whenever she turns to him. She leans forward slightly and breathes in the smell of him. There's only a trace of his tobacco and his cologne. Stronger than this, and growing stronger, is the smell of a butchery, of something recently butchered. As she leaves the house, the walker clanking patiently, she sees his pipe sitting on the table by the door, along with a bowl of dying lemon-colored roses and a tube of half-used superglue. Mrs. Bell is waiting for her outside, perched on the bonnet of a yellow car, smoking a cigarette. Everything looks impossibly bright and out of joint. And Mrs. Bell, who can move far faster, approaches her with an apparent appetite to talk, to gather information about Patricia's reactions, perhaps to hurt Patricia with fresh revelations. But it's all too much. And before the other woman can get a word in, Patricia says, "I'll be leaving for Durban now, Janet. I'm sorry, I won't be able to return for the funeral." Mrs. Bell is stopped in her tracks, perhaps stunned into submission by the violence in her voice, or the note of what sounds like blame. In order to soften this, Patricia adds, "I'm sure the last thing his children will need is me hanging about." "Oh, of course," says Mrs. Bell, bright and sharp, deciding perhaps that Patricia is not such a worthy opponent after all.
Patricia did not see the suicide coming, nor did she foresee how Looksmart would turn out. Patricia and John belonged to the old order, formerly privileged white people living on their expansive but crumbling estates. They are relics from the past to be stared at. Take note of the recurring fish comparison. Read through the summaries and analyses of today's readings. When you've done that, answer the questions in your study guide. Patricia contemplates the death rituals of the ancient Egyptians. It would be interesting to draw a comparison here with Cleopatra's view of death in Antony and Cleopatra. The lives of Looksmart and Rachel are intertwined for Patricia. Her sorrow over Rachel was lightened by Looksmart's presence in her life. Patricia challenges herself here. Why would she want to look at John's corpse, knowing that he expressly instructed her to stay away, to take her leave? The title given to this section in the English Experience Study Guide is clever. The denouement. Is this an ending or is it a beginning? Is death the end? It's an uncomfortable and strange intimacy here. A servant and a wife of a man who has regressed mentally and physically. For those of you with aged and frail grandparents and relatives, you'll recognize the arduousness of these tasks. Rachel haunts Patricia and Richard in different ways. The idea of a bereaved parent digging up a child's grave is both horrific and moving. Is that some sympathy stirring for Richard? Just a little bit? It is apparent that Looksmart became Patricia's substitute child, to a point. There is no doubt that he was the source of much joy for her. Patricia has lost so much. There's the obvious loss of her child, but it's more than that. She's lived a life of loss. Her dreams of a happy marriage, a successful farm, a stable family unit, she hasn't had any of this. And to live with such constant disappointment has numbed her. It stunted her emotions. To look on John's corpse, she hopes, will force her to feel these losses, really feel the emotions invested in them. The question is, does it work? Is she able to process her multiple griefs in this way? We all know a Mrs. Bill. You know, that self-righteous busybody in the community, always poking her nose into other people's business. Here she is. Maybe a different name to the one that you know personally. We've almost finished reading the novel. Make sure that your notes are up to date. We live in uncertain times, grade 12s. You can't control what happens around you, but you can control your responses to these events. So make the most of these online lessons. If you need help, you know how to get hold of me. I look forward to our next lesson. Goodbye, Matrix.